So, you want to own the Shelby Company Limited, a bookmaking outfit run out of a back room in Small Heath, Birmingham, in the years after the Great War. Most people look at this business and see a gang, razors, flat caps, protection money, violence as a revenue stream. That is the mistake, and it is a very expensive one, because the money in this operation has almost nothing to do with any of that. The Shelby fortune is built on a single clause in a single Act of Parliament that made one kind of gambling illegal everywhere in Britain except a handful of specific fields. Control access to those fields and you are not running a gang at all, you are running a licensing monopoly. So let us work out what it actually costs to own the loophole.
First, correct your picture of the asset. This is not a criminal enterprise that happens to take bets. It is a bookmaking business that happens to be criminal, and the distinction decides everything downstream. Bookmaking itself is an old, boring, mathematically sound trade. You take money from people betting on horses, you set your prices so the total book adds up to more than 100%, and the difference is your margin. On real bookmaking figures, a book balanced to around 110 to 120% leaves a theoretical margin of roughly 9 to 17% of everything staked. That is the entire product, not luck, not intimidation, not cleverness about horses. Arithmetic applied consistently to very large numbers of very small bets.
So why is a mathematically sound business being run by armed men out of a back room? Because of the Street Betting Act of 1906. That act made it a criminal offence to place a cash bet with a bookmaker in a street or in any public place. It did not ban betting. It banned one specific method of betting, the only method available to a man with wages in his pocket and no bank account. And it was enforced badly. Courts were reluctant to imprison anyone, fines were modest enough to be treated as a cost of trading, and the police had very little appetite for arresting men over something the entire working population was doing openly. A law that everybody breaks and nobody respects does not stop an industry, it reorganizes it.
Now, the clause that builds the Shelby fortune, and it is worth stating precisely, Section 2 of that same Act deliberately excluded racecourses from its provisions. Cash betting in the street was a crime. Cash betting at a racecourse, standing in the betting ring in the open air, was completely lawful. Same bet, same money, same horse, same bookmaker. The only variable that decided whether it was a criminal act or a legitimate trade was the patch of ground the two men were standing on. That is not a small legal detail. That is the creation, by statute, of a small number of physical locations in Britain where an otherwise illegal industry becomes legal, and anything finite, valuable, and legally protected is not a crime scene. It is real estate.
And there was a second exemption, which tells you exactly what the law was really for. Betting on credit remained entirely legal. A gentleman with a telephone, a bank account, and a standing arrangement with a bookmaker could place bets all afternoon without breaking any law at all, settling up at the end of the week like any other tradesman's bill. A factory worker with £3 or £4 a week in coin had no account, no telephone, and no credit, so his only route to the same wager was cash, which was now a crime. The Act did not reduce gambling by any measurable amount. It simply drew a line between the customers who could bet legally and the customers who could not, and handed everyone on the wrong side of that line to whoever was willing to serve them.
So price the market that was pushed underground, because the volume is the whole reason this is worth fighting over. Betting was, by a distance, the most popular working-class pastime in Britain at the time. practiced weekly by an enormous share of the adult male population in every industrial city. A single backstreet operation in a dense industrial district could handle bets from hundreds of men in an afternoon, most of them staking small coins rather than notes. Individually, these are trivial sums: sixpence, a shilling, occasionally half a crown. Aggregated across a city, across 6 days a week, across every factory gate and pub yard, they become one of the largest continuous flows of untaxed cash anywhere in the country. Nobody was policing that seriously. Somebody was always going to collect it.
Now the machinery of the street business, because it explains the cost structure. A street bookmaker does not stand on a corner himself. He works through runners, men who collect written slips and coins from factory yards, shop rounds and back alleys, and carry them back to a fixed point. On real figures, runners were paid on commission, generally in the range of 5 to 7.5% of what they collected. On top of that sit lookouts watching for police, a list house where the odds and results are posted, and a settling operation to pay out winners the same evening. Every one of those roles is a wage against a margin of 9 to 17%. Before a single policeman is paid, roughly half the theoretical margin is already gone.
And here is why that business, however large, can never actually become an empire. It is illegal, which means it is cash only, which means it cannot be banked, cannot be insured, cannot borrow, and cannot be sold. It cannot enforce a debt in court, because the debt itself is unlawful. It cannot expand into a new city by opening premises, because premises are exactly what the law is looking for. And it scales linearly at best, because every additional street requires additional runners, additional lookouts, and additional risk, with no efficiency gained anywhere. A business like this can generate an impressive weekly income for a family, and still be structurally worthless as an asset, because there is no version of it that compounds, and no buyer who could ever legally purchase it.
And then there is the line item nobody writes down. Police tolerance was not free, and it was not principled. It was purchased, routinely, in cash, and treated by everyone involved as an ordinary operating expense of the trade. Fines, when they came, were modest enough to be budgeted for rather than feared, and prosecutions were sporadic enough to price as an occasional loss rather than an existential threat. What that produces is a business whose single largest protection cost is paid to the institution supposedly shutting it down. And critically, that payment buys nothing permanent. It buys this month. There is no contract, no receipt, and no guarantee that the next inspector transferred into the district will honor an arrangement he had no part in making.
Which is why the ambitious operator stops looking at the street entirely and starts looking at the only ground in Britain where none of this applies, at a racecourse, on a race day, inside the betting ring. Everything that is a crime 3 miles away becomes an ordinary licensed trade. No runners are needed because the customer walks to you. No lookouts are needed because there is nothing to look out for. No police payments are needed because there is nothing to pay them not to see. The same 9 to 17% margin now falls to the bottom line almost intact on much larger stakes from a customer who has travelled specifically to gamble and brought money to do it with. The racecourse is not a better version of the street business. It is a different business entirely.
So understand what a bookmaker at a racecourse actually needs, because it is a physically specific thing. He needs a pitch. A pitch is a defined standing position in the betting ring, a few feet of ground, from which he displays his odds, takes cash, and pays out. He needs a board, chalk, a satchel, a clerk to record the bets, and a position. The board is trivial. The clerk is a wage.
the position is everything, and the position is the only one of those 5 he cannot simply go out and buy, because a racecourse betting ring is a fixed physical space with a fixed number of viable standing positions on a fixed number of race days per year, and no amount of capital creates a 61st pitch in a ring that holds 60.
And position is not a matter of preference. It is the entire difference between a good day and a wasted one. A pitch nearest the rails and the grandstand steps sits directly in the path of the crowd and takes bets continuously from men walking past without being sought out. A pitch at the back of the ring takes bets only from men who have already walked past everyone else and not yet placed their money. On any realistic reading of foot traffic, a front position handles several times the turnover of a rear one across the same afternoon, with identical costs and an identical margin. 2 bookmakers of equal skill, equal capital, and equal odds will end the day with entirely different books, purely because of where they were permitted to stand.
Now, the fact that turns all of this into a business: those positions were not owned and they were not sold by the racecourse in any orderly way. They were allocated, informally, on the day, by whoever had established the practical authority to say who stands where. There is no register, no lease, no title deed, and no court a bookmaker can appeal to when he is told to move. Which means the pitch, the single scarce input in a legal and highly profitable trade, sits permanently unclaimed at the moment of every meeting, available to be assigned by anybody with enough organized men present to make the assignment stick. That is not a gap in the law, it is a vacancy, and it is the most valuable vacancy in Britain.
Which brings us to the reveal. The Shelby Company does not make its money taking bets. It makes its money deciding who is allowed to take bets on the only ground where taking bets is legal. Every bookmaker at every meeting under its control pays for the privilege of standing in a specific place and pays again for everything that comes with it. That is not a protection racket in the ordinary sense, because there is a genuine service being sold and a genuine scarcity being managed. What is being sold is access to a statutory exemption. Parliament created a legal monopoly and then declined to say who administers it, and the Shelby Company simply stepped into the empty administrative role and started charging for it.
And once you hold that position, the number of things you can charge for multiplies immediately. There is the pitch fee itself, paid for the standing position. There is a charge for the printed list of runners and riders, which every bookmaker needs, and which is far easier to supply centrally. There is chalk, boards, water, and the small physical necessities of a day's trading. There is a settling and dispute service, because 2 bookmakers arguing over a payout need somebody whose ruling ends the argument. And there is protection, which in practice means protection from the very organization selling it, but also, genuinely, from every rival organization that would otherwise take the pitch by force. 5 separate charges on a captive customer at every meeting for something that cost almost nothing to produce.
So put a number on a single race day. A significant meeting supports on the order of 100 bookmakers working the rings. If the combined charges extract even a few pounds from each of them across the afternoon, that is several £100 collected in a day, against costs of almost nothing beyond the wages of the men present to collect it. Set that against a working wage of £3 to £4 a week, and the scale becomes clear. A single afternoon's collection from men who are themselves running perfectly legal businesses is worth roughly what a factory worker earns in 18 months to 2 years, and unlike the street operation, none of it is illegal to receive, none of it requires a runner, and none of it has to be hidden from a bank.
And now the racecourse wars make sense, because the fighting was never about territory in the way it is usually described. Two organisations, one operating out of the industrial Midlands and one out of London, spent years in open and repeated conflict at meetings across the country. Not over drugs, not over women, not over insults, and not over any illegal trade at all. They were fighting over the right to administer the pitch allocation at legal racecourses, and specifically over which of them collected at the northern courses and which at the southern. That is a fight between two firms over an exclusive distribution agreement conducted with razors instead of solicitors, because there was no solicitor either of them could hire. The violence looks like gang warfare. Structurally, it is a market being divided.
Which reframes the razors entirely, so let us be exact about it. Violence in this business generates no revenue whatsoever. Not 1 penny arrives because a man was cut. What arrives is a pitch fee, and the pitch fee arrives whether or not anybody was touched. Violence is what you spend to establish and defend the position from which fees can be charged, which makes it a capital expenditure, and an expensive one. It costs men, injuries, legal exposure, police attention, retaliation, and the standing cost of keeping enough people available to fight when required. A firm that spends more on enforcement than it collects in fees is simply a badly run firm, regardless of how frightening it looks from the outside. Reputation is the cheap substitute. A firm known to enforce rarely has to.
Now assemble the whole thing. Take a firm administering pitches across a circuit of racecourses, each course running perhaps a dozen or more meeting days a year. Say control across 6 such courses. At several £100 collected per meeting day, that is a 5-figure annual income in 1920s money. Against that sit the wages of the men who collect and enforce, travel, and the occasional catastrophic cost of a serious confrontation. Even after all of it, what remains is an income that would place this operation among the substantial businesses of its city, generated almost entirely from a statutory exemption the firm did not create, does not own, and pays nothing to use.
And compare that directly against actually taking the bets, because this is the comparison that settles the argument. A bookmaker on a good pitch is running a real business with real risk. He can be wrong about a race, he can be caught badly on a favourite, and a single afternoon can genuinely cost him money. The firm collecting the pitch fee carries none of that. It is paid before the first race and keeps every penny whether the favourite wins or loses, whether the day is busy or dead, whether the bookmaker ends the afternoon rich or ruined. That is the difference between operating in a market and owning the entrance to it. One takes a share of the outcome, the other takes a fee on the attempt, and the fee is not contingent on anything at all.
So, why does a firm this profitable bother going legitimate at all? Because the model has a hard ceiling and it is not a moral one. Pitch income is cash, collected informally from an arrangement with no legal basis, which means it cannot be banked in volume without explanation, cannot be shown to a lender, and cannot be used as the foundation of anything larger. A firm holding thousands of pounds it cannot account for is not wealthy in any useful sense. It is liquid and trapped. Legitimate businesses solve exactly that problem, because a factory, an import license, or a shipping contract turns unexplainable cash into explainable revenue, and explainable revenue can borrow, compound, and be sold. The move-up market is not ambition. It is the only available exit from a business model that cannot grow past its own paper bag.
And the ending is written into the founding fact, which is the elegant cruelty of this whole business. Everything the firm owns rests on Parliament having made cash betting illegal off course and legal on it. That is not a market position,
It is a legislative accident, and legislatures correct their accidents. In 1960, the Betting and Gaming Act finally legalized licensed betting shops on ordinary high streets across Britain. The moment that happened, the racecourse stopped being the only lawful place to place a cash bet, and the pitch stopped being scarce in any way that mattered. No rival defeated this business, no police operation dismantled it. The exemption it was built on was simply repealed, and the entire asset evaporated with nothing left behind to sell.
So close the book. A street operation with real weekly income, roughly half its margin consumed by runners at 5 to 7.5%, lookouts, settlers, and police payments, and structurally incapable of ever being sold. A racecourse operation, charging 5 separate lines to around 100 captive bookmakers across 70 or more meeting days a year. A tens of thousands of pounds annual income in a decade when a working man earned under 200. Violence running permanently as a capital expenditure that generates no revenue of its own. And underneath every bit of it, a single statutory exemption, held by nobody, defended by force, and repealable at any time by men who would never set foot in a betting ring.
Convert it, and the scale lands properly. An income of £20,000 a year in the 1920s, set against a working wage under 200, represents earnings of well over 100 times the ordinary income of the time. Apply that same multiple to a modern working wage, and you are describing a business generating several £1,000,000 a year, tax-free, from a customer base that has no alternative supplier and no legal right to complain. And yet the enterprise itself would be valued at close to nothing by any serious buyer, because it owns no premises, no license, no contract, and no enforceable right to a single one of its revenue lines. It is one of the most profitable businesses in its city, and one of the least valuable, at exactly the same time.
So, should you buy the Shelby Company Limited? On the numbers, it is extraordinary, and almost none of that has anything to do with the reputation attached to it. The razors did not make the money. The fear did not make the money. A clause exempting racecourses from a badly written betting law made the money. And the firm's real achievement was noticing, before anyone else did, that a legal exemption with no appointed administrator is simply a monopoly lying on the ground waiting to be picked up. The lesson underneath this business is not about gangs or Birmingham or horses. It is that when a government makes something illegal for most people and legal for a few, it has not reduced that activity at all. It has just created a very valuable doorway, and it has almost never bothered to decide who is standing in it.